It's part 5 when we're going to get into designing for mass production. The same way Ford revolutionized interchangeable parts and mass production for the automobile, components and variables really revolutionized product design software. It allows you to create something in one place and make it completely consistent in all the other places that it shows up, a lot like how it's coded. This one's a really exciting lesson, and it's a little tricky, so let's go in and see how components are built. Most modern design software is all about building a lot of screens and a lot of UX all at once with consistent components. That means they inevitably end up building some kind of support for reusing designs that you have made in the past. Now, that can be copying and pasting something big, but it can also be a small element of your design like a button. And today's example is going to be a button because that is, let's face it, something that you're probably going to be using quite a bit in your designs. So it really starts with just getting a frame going and making something that fits and is appropriate to what you need. In this case, let's make a button together. I'm going to a button is just a rectangle, no surprises there, and I'm going to type a label. Now, this is the world's least attractive button. What I'm going to do is select both of these with Shift and clicking them both, or I could drag both, and I'm going to apply an auto layout. And I'm going to do that with Shift A. And we covered auto layouts in the last lesson, but you can see its alignment is center, it has dimensions, and everything is kind of dialed in. Still, I don't want that button to be that thick. So let's set some rules for this button. Specifically, I want the button to have, let's call it, 50 points of padding left and right, and 100 top and bottom. That doesn't sound quite right. Let's change its dimensions so that it's hugging the content. Yeah, see, that's too much. I typically like to do double on the left and right than I do in the top and bottom. So let's do, in this case, 24 and 12. Just zooming in so I can see my button a little bit better. Now, let's dial in and start getting the properties going on our button. Here, I'm going to make the label bold, and let's say I'm going to make the label white. Now, nobody's going to be able to see that, so I'm going to make my button a lot darker. Say a dark blue. And since we learned this already, let's dial in a couple of our properties. We'll round the button, and then let's make it a little hard to have something that we really like and want to use over and over again. So I'm going to put a little stroke inside the button. I'm going to make that stroke a lot less opaque, so you can see it's see-through, and that just gives me a little bit of contrast. Maybe I'm going to add a drop shadow to this button, and let's do one of my favorite kind of drop shadows, a double drop, where we take it and we have a little bit more and it's a little bit faded out, and then there's actually a second drop shadow that is a lot smaller and a lot tighter for contrast, sitting right underneath it. So this is a button with 2 drop shadows, a stroke, a label, and let's even make sure that the label's center aligned and that the label itself is not hugged, but fills the auto layout that it's in, so that as this gets wider, the button label itself gets wider. Okay, now that is a lot of work, and we don't want to be doing that over and over and over again, so it's time to make this a component. And the easiest way of doing that is right-clicking and then going Create Component. I, of course, love the keyboard shortcut. In this case, it's Option-Command-K. And I'll say Create Component. So the software now is making this a symbol or a component, or you can even call it a smart object if you're referencing the Adobe days. And you want to name this. So in this case, button. Now, you see this 4 diamond thing. There's basically something saying this is the original component that you've made. And now, when I copy and I come over here and paste it in, you see in my layers file an empty diamond. And so this is saying this is an instance or a copy, a clone of the original. So I can come and still resize this and treat it as though it's the original object, but when I go and do that, it's straying from what the original component was. Why is that important? Well, you might want to reset it. So I can come over here and say, up here in my more actions, I might want to reset an element. So in this case, I want to reset the size, and my button goes back. Maybe what I've done is I've selected this and I've decided that it's going to be light and that it's going to be a horrible green. Now let's do red. Well, that is not what the copy is, but it's still respecting the original. So if I make a change here to drop the word button, you can see the word button, the word label is cut out so that it's still saying button, but it kept all the other styles. These are kind of overriding those properties of your component. But again, you want to come back here and reset it and reset maybe just the color, and you leave the font alone, or I could even reset all changes and really reset it back. Let's get rid of these. And maybe what I actually want to do is create both a good and bad version of this button, or a positive and a negative. Well, the way I could do that is, yes, by making a copy and changing it to red, but maybe I want to make that more official so that when I'm designing, I just have the option of saying, hey, I want this to be the positive or negative version of this button. So here in my original component, I'm going to create a property. So up in this menu, I can add a property, and in this case, a variant. And a variant, what this does is it makes a different type of button. Now I can select this button and make another version of it. You can see this dotted line has extended out, and I can name this property. So in this case, I'm going to make a warning button. And here, I'm going to make a default button. And what's different about the warning button? Well, it's red. Really looks kind of patriotic, don't you think? Now, when I'm making a copy of the button, like over here, I'll show you a fresh copy. I can choose property 1. Do I want it to be default, or do I want it to be warning? Now, saying property 1 isn't particularly helpful, so I want to name that property. So I'll select the original, and instead of property 1, I'll say type. Now, just like you can apply auto layout to anything else, you can even apply auto layouts to component containers. That's what I like to do to keep it tidy. So I'll hit Shift A here, and now I have a nice component container where I can do different things. So here I want to do a disabled button. So in type, I'll type disabled. And what is a disabled button? I'm going to say that the option's not available, so I'll make it gray. Maybe also what I'll do is I'll take the type in it and I'll tint that back too and call it disabled. Now I've changed the type here, and I want to show you this because I think it's important. If I take this button and I make another copy and I say can't do that, and then I take this and I decide to switch the type from default to disabled, you can see the copy is changing too. And maybe I want, once I type can't do that, that I want it to be respected. I want it to remember. In that case, you want to create a new property inside of your component. Let me show you how to do that. I'm going to change my padding here so this is a little bit more even. And I want this word button to basically be something that when I change it in any of my copies, it's always remembered. So over here in the right-hand side with my layer selected, you can see the word button is here. there is this ability to create a text property. And a text property makes it so that you're telling the component this is a particular property, just like a fill, just like a stroke, that I expect that I'm going to want to change. So I'll create a text property here, and I don't want it to be called text. I want it to be called button label, and I want it to say button. I'll create that property. Now, doing that once isn't enough. You want to do that across the board. So I'm going to select disabled here, and I'm going to select button. And over in our mixed values, you can see it's saying mixed because one of them is disabled, one of them is button. I'm going to use apply text property, and I can either make a new one or I can apply it to the existing property that I've already created. In this case, button label. So let's make them both button label and watch what happens. So it changes them all now to be the word button. And it does that, but now when I say button 3 or button 4, you can see it now changing in every instance. Why do I want to create a property? Well, I'll show you. When you make a new copy of this button, you actually get a new property exposed. So you can use the menu to actually change the value of warning. But also now, if warning is not the style that I want, and I want to say smile, I can now change what type of button it is, and because each type has the same text property field, it will respect whatever I typed in there originally. So now we have a component, we have versions of that component, and we have properties. And you can continue to build in the complexity of these things. Here's how to troubleshoot one of these buttons. Let's say it gets a little weird when it squishes. Well, we want to select all of our buttons and make sure that the padding isn't so severe. And you can fix that over here. Or maybe we've decided in our 3 buttons that we're going to actually make the corner radius a little lighter. And I've dialed it down just like that in mass. So now I can put a bunch of buttons across my interface and make that a reusable component that I can use in other places. Components aren't the only part of designing for reuse, however. Sometimes you want to lock down a set of rules or numbers or properties that you want to be able to reuse. For example, up until now, I've been saying with every single button that the corner radius is 8, but perhaps I want to make that a rule. Well, I can do that in my entire file with something called variables. First, click on nothing, something that has no selection whatsoever, and then you can see local variables. Now, local variables, essentially, they're a really robust way for us to be able to set rules or create properties or numbers that are static. So here I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to make it a number. And in this case, I'm going to do small and the value will be 4. Then I'm going to make a new variable. That'll be a number, and I'll make medium. I'll make that 8. And then, of course, you can right-click and just duplicate. And I'm going to do large, and that's 12. Now, with these small, medium, and large variables, they simply equal 4, 8, and 12. So when I come and select my button, instead of typing in the number 8, I can use this small little apply variable button to apply a small, a medium, or a large. And now all that I have to remember is that I'm using small, medium, or large, and you can see the number in the instance changes so that it's a selection, and that I have to break the relationship, or essentially detach it to make a change. So it's a good signal to help preventing mistakes and inconsistencies in your file of, oh, wait a minute, that's supposed to be medium, or that's supposed to be large. You can still override. As you can see, this button is now unique. You can still override, but it's related to the initial. So I'll select these three and I'll make them large. And it even applies to padding. So padding, I'm going to do large padding on the sides and say small padding on the top. That looks a little wild, so we'll do medium. And so you can really build up whole systems of sizing and spacing and the ability to take something small and then set a few rules, and then you're off to the races. Now let's use variables to actually create some color rules as well. So I'm going to open up my local variables, and in this case, I'm going to create a variable that is a color, and I'm going to name it primary. And I'm going to have primary, literally going to use the existing blue. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to make secondary. And that's going to be a blue we've never seen before, gray. Then I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to do warning. I really ended up with a real red, white, and blue. So you can see instead of choosing, I used the eyedropper and sampled there. And then I'll duplicate. Let's do disabled. And an unavailable option. I'm actually going to start. Maybe I'll steal this color. Hit enter. And I'm going to make it even lighter and even bluer. So a different gray than I have. Well, now inside my buttons, same thing. I can choose this and apply primary to that. I can apply disabled to this. I can apply warning here. Do this a little bit lighter. And now all of those rules, instead of choosing any old color and having the full range available to me, I can choose primary, secondary. I can choose warning and disabled, but that's not the type of button. This is just the fill color. So you can see how components and variables are really, really powerful. They're so powerful, in fact, that there's one big thing that ends up saving you a ton of time and is pretty wild, which is modes. So here we have a name and a value in these variables. Well, I can add a mode, and let's use the most simple analogy here. Dark and light. And dark and light mode basically are a way for me to specify a new set of rules and a new set of colors. And when I apply these, let's double all the spacing here. 8 is 16, 4 is 8. And let me show you one more color that I'm going to call background. And I'm going to do white, and really, really dark gray, and really, really light white. Now let me show you the power of this in action, okay? I'm going to make one layout here. I'm going to make its fill background. I'm going to take the appearance and add a variable mode of light. I'm going to take all of these buttons, or all the buttons here. I'm going to make the label color. Instead of white, I'm going to make it background so that it matches the background. I'm going to take all these buttons and I'm going to add an auto layout to them. And then when I add this auto layout, I'm going to make them all apply a variable, large space apart. Now, what I've just done is I've taken all the variables, and let me make the background of this document a little darker so we can see what's going on here. I've just taken all of these variables, my 4, my 8s, my 12s, my backgrounds, my primaries, and they're all linked up to all the properties in here. So I have basically set up a bunch of rules that I want this layout to obey. And I'll center this here. Now I'm going to make a copy. And so let's call this my light mode. and I'll call this my dark mode. Just by coming over to the appearance and choosing a new mode, in this case, dark, it has now gone and looked up what is dark large, what is the primary color, what is the background color, and even though this is the same exact component, this is now respecting a whole new set of rules. And it still means that if I come up to dark mode and I say large is now 32, it gets even further different. Or that in dark mode, my buttons are actually bright yellow. You can see that change. So all of these modes and all of these variables are a way to create amazing versioning and complexity and support multiple modes and devices and tons of options and creativity. But now when somebody says, hey, I actually think all those buttons are too rounded, you can select the original and you can say, okay, I'm going to move from large to small. And then across the board, sometimes dozens or even hundreds of screens are going to get updated. And you can look, see these little guys that didn't respect the rules. Why? Well, come up here, we can reset, and then we can reset things like changes and fills and all that kind of stuff to get it back to the original button. So overriding, setting components, setting modes, variables, it's amazing complexity, but allows for amazing flexibility. Of course, all of this means that sometimes finding what the heck is going on in your files is more complicated. So next, we're going to talk about finding that source of truth.